So let's take a look at simple interest. And so simple interest is going to be our first financial topic, and it's one of those things that it's the easiest thing to understand whenever we're looking at percentages and how finance works. One of the things that we want to get about simple interest is that it's basically just multiplication. We'll do a couple of problems that I'll have to do with that multiplication, but what I want you to do is I want you to just think to yourself that basically I'm just multiplying. I'm going to end up multiplying something we call a principal times the rate at which we're getting a return on our money times the time. Okay? And so what we're going to do first here with simple interest is we're going to define a couple of things. One is we're first going to define principal. So the principal is the amount of money placed into an account at the beginning of a term. So what we want to think about is we want to think about this as something like I have $1,000 that I've saved from my paycheck, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it into a savings account. That's called my principal. Okay? It's what I put in, generally, if we want to think about it from that perspective. What I put in. It's a starting point. The second thing that we want to get is we want to get what is interest. So interest is the amount of money that is earned or taken away. And that is if, say for example, we're working with a credit card that is earned or taken away based upon the principal. So the idea behind interest is that in exchange for us giving them money, what will happen often is that a bank will, or excuse me, in exchange for using our money, right, a bank will give us a certain percentage of what we put in as kind of like a payback. So what will often happen is that banks will do things like, okay, they'll give out loans, or they will fund projects, or they will fund businesses. And in exchange for funding the businesses, they charge the people that they're giving the money to a certain amount of money, and then they will give back to us, the people who have put money into the bank, a certain percentage, a little chunk, okay? That is basically like our payment for keeping money in the bank, okay? And that is generally, traditionally what has happened. Now there are different banks now that are not doing that so much, or the rates are very, 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 very low, especially for savings accounts. But in general, that's kind of the idea. The idea is that interest is an amount of money that's given back to us because we have basically either invested or we have placed our money inside of a bank or a financial institution. So that's interest. The next thing is the rate. Okay? And the rate we're going to represent as R. Right? Just like interest we're going to represent as I, and the principal we're going to represent as P. And we'll talk about those more in a little bit. The rate is the amount of money as a percentage, or rather the amount of money as a percentage that we get back for our principal. So this is not an exact number. Basically what it is, and maybe amount isn't the right word, maybe we should say the rate of return is oftentimes what we'll use. It's essentially, it's like what portion of the whole. Okay, so this is going to end up being it's a fraction or a percentage, or oftentimes written as a decimal. Okay, and we're going to take that decimal as a part of the whole. All right, so it is a piece of the whole value that we are getting back for our particular investment. And then finally we have time, and that's T, and that is the amount of time that we have invested a particular principal. So these are the basic terms. We'll talk in just a second about what their relationship is to one another. But basically what we have to get is first we have a principal. That's how much I put into an account at the beginning of time. Secondly, I have interest. That's how much I'm going to get back, like in terms of their amount of money. R is the rate. The rate actually tells me how what percentage of my principal I'm going to be getting back as interest based upon a particular given amount of time. And then time is how long I have put the money into the account. And time is generally going to be stated in terms of years. And we're going to see that in just a moment. So let's take an example to see how this kind of works. So in our example, what we're going to say is we're going to start out with $1,000. Okay, so we've got $1,000. And that's going to be my principal. So I'm going to say P equals $1,000. And that's my principal. And that's how much I'm going to put into the bank at time 0. So I come in. Here's my bank. Okay. I give them $1,000. All right. And what happens is I say to the bank, I say, okay, you know what? I'm going to keep it in there for a particular amount of time. You get to hold on to it for me. Oftentimes we think to ourselves, okay, I'm going to take it back, but that's not really what we're going to be doing here in this particular example. And so what they say to me is they say, okay, so in exchange, the bank says we're going to give you 0.5%. So 0.5% interest per year. And this is going to be what's called simple interest. So you're only going to get 0.5% of your interest per year. Okay? And so that's going to be my R. So R is going to equal, and we rewrite it as a decimal, 0.005. Okay? So we take this percentage, we're going to change it into decimal. That's my rate. And the time, I'm going to hold it in there for 1 year. So I hold it in there for 1 year. Okay? And then what I do, we have this formula, and it's basically that the interest, I, is going to equal the principal times the rate times the time. So I'm going to figure out my interest. That's going to be 1,000 times 0.005 times 1, because it's going to be just the 1 year. And so when I do that, I take 0.005 times 1,000. I do that in my calculator. What I get is I get $5. So what happens is I show back up after 1 year. So after 1 year, I show back up, and the bank gives me $1,005. Right? Basically, it gives me my principal plus the interest. Now you might ask yourself, why would they do something like this? Well, the fact of the matter is that what they might be doing is they might be giving auto loans using my money to somebody else at 2%. So I get 0.5% on my savings account. They get 2% for giving the auto loan out. So they get to keep 1.5% difference. And that helps with their overhead and all different things, depending upon the kind of bank that you have, right? Mine's a credit union. And so credit unions basically are not for profit. They pretty much just cover their overhead utilizing the percentage. They don't have profits. Other banks, like big national banks, they'll have profits. Okay? But that's the idea. I take my principal, okay? I get a percentage of my principal is going to be interest, and I utilize the simple calculation. This one here is called the simple interest calculation in order to figure out how much interest I actually have made. And then I get back my interest and I get back my principal. All right, let's take a look at another problem. Let's suppose that your bank offers you 1% simple interest, and I want to get that this is the kind of interest that I've got. We're going to look at other ones later, per year for a savings account. How much interest would you have accrued if you put $5,000 into the account for 1 year? So I want to find my interest. I'm going to use this simple interest equation. Interest is going to equal principal times rate times time. Okay, so that's interest equals principal times rate times time. My time is going to be in years. Okay, and so I got I is going to equal $5,000 is my principal. Okay, because that's what I'm putting in there. My rate is the 1%, and I'm going to write that as a decimal, 0.01 times my 1 year. Okay. So what that gives me is that's going to end up being $50. So I take 5,000 times 0.01, and that's $50. And so my interest is $50 just for putting my money into the bank. That's how that works. A couple other things I want to point out here is this word accrued. What it means to accrue is it means to gain interest. So if we see that word accrued, what we know is that we're looking at something, we're looking at gaining interest for a particular investment. Okay? And the other piece here is we're looking at simple interest, and hence why we're going to use this equation right here, because that's my simple interest equation. Let's take a look at another example. Let's suppose that the bank offered you 1% simple interest per year. You've now invested $5,000, but you choose instead to invest for 3 years. How much interest would you have accrued? Well, what we notice is that, again, we're going to be looking for simple interest, and we're looking for that accrual of interest. So we want to know how much interest we're going to get back. So again, we're going to use this interest equals principal times rate times time. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, okay, well, my principal still is $5,000. My rate is still 0.01 because it's 1%, but now I've got a different amount of time. Time is now equal to 3 years. Well, it's still the same exact equation. Instead of t equals 1, which is for 1 year, we're going to actually use t equals 3. So my interest is going to equal the principal, $5,000, times my rate, 0.01 now, times 3, which ends up giving me $150. And there we go. And that is actually the interest that we would accrue for 3 years. Notice in simple interest it's pretty simple, hence the name. $50 was for 1 year, so it makes sense that we would actually make $150 for 3 years. Okay, and that's how simple interest works. Basically, we're going to make the same amount on our principal for every single year. When we look at compounding interest, we're going to see something that's different. Okay, but for right now, when we work with simple interest, this is how this is going to work. Okay, now, what about the question of like how much money would I actually have at the end of this time? So let's say I'm going to answer this question. How much money would I have after 3 years? How much money total would I have after 3 years? Well, what you want to think to yourself is you're going to start out, that's going to be the principal that we had plus the interest. And that's going to be my total. So we started out with $5,000 and then we added the $150 interest. So that means we now have $5,150. Okay? And that's basically the idea of the total that we have. You take the principal plus the interest. Instead of my next example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually give you a formula that you can use in order to kind of like do it all at once, right? But it basically comes from this idea. Take the principal plus the interest. Let's take a look at another example. Let's suppose that the bank offered you 1% simple interest per year. You've now invested $5,000, but you choose instead to invest for 3 years. How much interest would you have accrued? Well, what we notice is that, again, we're going to be looking for simple interest, and we're looking for that accrual of interest. So we want to know how much interest we're going to get back. So again, we're going to use this interest equals principal times rate times time. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, okay, well, my principal still is $5,000. My rate is still 0.01 because it's 1%, but now I've got a different amount of time. Time is now equal to 3 years. Well, it's still the same exact equation. Instead of t equals 1, which is for 1 year, we're going to actually use t equals 3. So my interest is going to equal the principal, $5,000, times my rate, 0.01 now, times 3, which ends up giving me $150. And there we go. And that is actually the interest that we would accrue for 3 years. Notice in simple interest it's pretty simple, hence the name. $50 was for 1 year, so it makes sense that we would actually make $150 for 3 years. Okay, and that's how simple interest works. Basically, we're going to make the same amount on our principal for every single year. When we look at compounding interest, we're going to see something that's different. Okay, but for right now, when we work with simple interest, this is how this is going to work. Okay, now, what about the question of like how much money would I actually have at the end of this time? So let's say I'm going to answer this question. How much money would I have after 3 years? How much money total would I have after 3 years? Well, what you want to think to yourself is you're going to start out, that's going to be the principal that we had plus the interest. And that's going to be my total. So we started out with $5,000 and then we added the $150 interest. So that means we now have $5,150. Okay? And that's basically the idea of the total that we have. You take the principal plus the interest. Instead of my next example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually give you a formula that you can use in order to kind of like do it all at once, right? But it basically comes from this idea. Take the principal plus the interest. All right, let's suppose that we invest $15,000 in an account that gains 4% simple interest per year. How much money total would we have after 5 years? So we're looking for the total amount of money now. Okay, so that's what we're looking for here. And so consequently that total given that we're using simple interest, is going to equal the principal times 1 plus the rate times time. Right? That's our equation for our total. So the total then is going to equal, I'm going to put my principal of $15,000 times 1 plus the rate, which is, it's 4%, so written as a decimal, it's 0.04 times the time of 5. I'll use my order of operations and I'll get 15,000 times 1 plus 0.2, and this will equal 15,000 times 1.2, which will end up equaling $18,000. Not too shabby. We've made $3,000. If you kind of look at that, that's what's happened here, right? Our principal plus interest is equal to $18,000. So if I write, oh, I have $15,000 in principal plus my interest, then that's going to be $18,000. So subtracting 15,000 over, using just a little bit of algebra, I can see that my interest is $3,000. And if you don't want to complicate things too much using algebra, you can just think to yourself, well, if I started with 15 and I ended it with 18, how much did I make? I made $3,000. And that's how this total works. And that's how interest works, essentially. It's the additional added on for keeping your money inside of an account. Let's take a look at a slightly different problem, but one that's actually going to end up becoming very important as we do more work with financial math. And that is what happens if we don't have a full year, but instead we have partial years? Because if we have partial years, we can't actually put in full year numbers, okay? It's a little bit different. Now, when it comes to simple interest, and actually it will come to compounding interest or any kind of interest that we look at, all we want to do is we want to translate, okay? So we're going to translate years into, in this case, months, okay? And that translation into months is basically we're going to divide up the year into 12. So that's basically going to be the number of months divided by 12. So let's take a look at this problem. You want to invest $1,000 in an account that takes 3% simple interest per year. How much interest will you have accrued after 9 months? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to notice that, remember, we've got our equation, interest equals PRT. Our principal is equal to $1,000. Our rate is equal to 0.03, it's 3%. And our time now, though, is going to be not in terms of years, but in terms of months. So I'm going to use this, a number of months divided by 12, right? Basically divide your year into 12. So that's going to be 9 over 12. And then I'm just going to use the formula just like I would normally. So that's interest equals 1,000 times 0.03 times 9 over 12. And when I multiply all those together, I get $22.50. And that's the amount of interest. Notice it's not the total, because I just want to know the amount of interest accrued, but that is the amount of interest accrued. So you look here, your time now is in terms of the fraction of the year. And the fraction of the year here is 9/12. You can write it as 9/12 in my world. You could also write it as a decimal. In this case, that would be 0.75. It's up to you. I like to put in the fractions because then it makes it very clear that I'm looking at time. Let's suppose that we have a different question now. We wanted to invest $2,000 for 18 months at 2% simple interest. How much money would you have total after 18 months? We want to notice first that we're asking the question about how much would you have total. So we're going to be using this equation. That is, our total is equal to the principal times 1 plus the rate times time. In parentheses, our principal is still $2,000. Our rate, in this case, is 0.02, and our time now is going to be 18 over 12. So even though 18 months is actually more than a year, because it's in terms of months, we actually want to continue to use 18 divided by 12, the actual number, the way that we can convert our years into months. So now I'm going to take t equals, and that'll be 2,000 times 1 plus 0.02 times, and this will be 18 over 12. So this will end up being 2,000 times 1 plus 0.02 times 1.5, and that equals 2,000 times 1 plus 0.03 which equals 2,000 times 1.03, which ends up equaling 2,060. So that's our total amount of money utilizing our total equation. And so I just want to make it clear that what we're going to do is that sometimes, and we're going to see this a lot more, especially inside of later sections, what we're going to do is we're going to end up transforming, like, say, for example, years into other time periods. In this case, months, because monthly, and we do that by dividing through by 12. Okay? We're going to see other instances in which we end up doing something like, say, for example, biannually. Biannually meaning we'll do it twice a year, and so instead of dividing by 12, we'll divide it by 2. Right? So there are different ways that we can actually divide up our year. Okay? And we'll learn more about those different time periods a little bit later on in the course. Now we want to actually go in and we want to figure out, or we want to get some information about a different unknown. Like, say, instead of the total amount of money or interest, where we actually have these formulas, we instead want to know something about, like, say, the rate or the amount of time that the interest loan was held for. Well, the fact of the matter is that this is what we use algebra for, and we're going to have to use some algebra in order to do this. We can still, in fact, utilize the equations that we were using before. We're just going to have to do a little bit of different manipulation. So suppose that you paid back $450 on a $400 loan, and you held the loan for 100 days. What was your simple annual interest rate? Find the value to the nearest 100th of a percent. Now, one thing to notice here is that we don't have months and we don't have years. Instead, we have days. Okay? And so with my time is going to end up being 100 days divided by 365. And that's because there's 365. That's the number of days in a year. Now, we sometimes will see something like what we call a banker's year or banker's days, and that is 360. So banker's days, when we use banker's days, they're going to be equal to 360. So instead of 365, you'd actually use 360. And that's just because it gives you a cleaner number. All right? 100 out of 360 is cleaner than 100 out of 365. All right? But for our purposes right now, we're going to utilize 365. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to say, well, what am I looking for? I want to know my interest rate. And if I notice that I got $450 back from a $400 loan. I want to find my simple annual interest rate. Well, how am I going to do that? And I've got two equations that I could use. Now, I'm going to give you the one that I think is going to actually be easier for us to do. So I want to use, in fact, the interest rate problem, the I problem, because it's going to end up being easier than going through and doing our total value, right? Which we could do. That's 450. But I want to use I equals PRT. So what I need to do is I need to first find the interest. Well, my total, okay, is going to equal the principal plus the interest. And in this case, I've got $450 as the total, and that equals $400 plus whatever amount of interest that I've got. Okay, so first, I want to find the amount of interest. Okay, so that's my first shot. So I'm going to subtract 400 from both sides, and what I get is I get that my interest is going to be $50. So that's going to be my I that I'm going to be putting into this interest rate equation. Now I look and I go, okay, well, I have a principal. My principal was the $400 loan. So P is going to equal 400, and my T is going to equal 100 divided by 365. Okay, and I'm going to write that in as a decimal because that's going to make my life a little bit easier. So we'll take 100 divided by 365, and that ends up giving me 0.27397, so 0.274 when I round up to 4 decimal places, or round to 4 decimal places. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug that into my equation. So my interest, which was $50, is going to equal 400 times R times 0.274. And the reason why I got this R right here is because that's what I'm looking for. I want to know the interest rate, so that should be the thing that's the unknown. right? Like whenever we do algebra, the thing that's going to be the unknown should be the variable inside of the equation. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little bit of simplification here. So that's going to give me 50 equals 109.589, essentially R times R. So I just multiplied 400 times 0.274, and I got 109.589 times R. Okay? Now, I'm just going to do a little bit of algebra. I'm going to divide by 109.589 to both sides. And that's going to give me R. I'm going to be left with R. So I'm going to take 50, and we're going to divide through by that answer. And that ends up giving me 0.4562. We got the point. And so that's our rate. Now that's not a percentage, but what that is that we can turn that into a percentage. So the percentage is then going to be 45.62%. We're just going to move over 2 decimal places, and that's to our nearest hundredth. So it's going to be 45.62%. So this takes a little bit of work, and we want to kind of think through this. You might actually have to practice this a few times, maybe even watch it a couple of times. One, we are going to be told that we get 450. That's our total, and this is our principal of $400. So we can use that in order to find our interest. Okay? And so our interest in this case, when I subtracted my principal, my total minus my principal, that gives me my interest, that's $50. Then I plug that whole thing into my interest equation, which is what I did right here. Okay, that's the interest equation. I equals the principal times the rate times the time, right? And my time in this case, right, we have to pay attention. We've got to actually convert 100 days into 365. So I get 400 times my unknown rate times time. Once I plugged in all the values into the equation, what I'm going to do is I'll go for first and simplify by multiplying 400 times 0.274. And then I'll divide through by that number, which turns out to be 109.589, to give me my rate. Finally, I have to turn the rate into a percentage. And that actually tells me what the total rate was for my loan. This is a great rate. If you ever get 45.62% for anything, you should jump on it right then and there. All right, let's ask the question, how much should you invest now at 2 3/4% simple interest in order to earn $140 interest in 11 months? So in this case, the idea that we're looking for how much you should invest now, and we want to get that's kind of shorthand for a principal. Like, what is the principal going to be, or what does the principal need to be, okay, in order to get $140 in interest? So we're going to use our interest formula. Interest equals P times R times T. We're going to see that our interest in this case is going to equal $140. Our rate is going to be 2.34%. So that's 2.75%, right? We've got to turn that into a decimal first. And that's going to then be 0.0275 as a decimal. And the time is in months, so it's going to be 11 out of 12 months. So now I'm going to write 140 is going to equal P, and I'm just going to put some parentheses around here just to make things very clear. Our rate, 0.0275 times 11 out of 12. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go in and I'm going to simplify. I'm going to take 0.0275, multiply by 11, and then divide it by 12, or multiply by 11/12. And that ends up giving me, this is going to end up being 140 equals P times, and rounded, it's 0.025208. Okay, somewhere around there. You can actually just put it into your calculator and keep it in your calculator. And then I'm going to take 140, and I'm going to divide through by this. So I'm going to divide both sides by 0.025208. Remember, that's your algebra. 0.25208. Okay? And that ends up giving me my principal should be equal to $5,553.79 when I round it down to the nearest cents. Okay? So essentially what's happening here is I want to figure out what's the variable that I'm going to solve for. Okay? What's the variable I'm solving for? Okay? 2, I actually want to know what is the information that I'm given. And then I write that down. All right? And that may actually we might have to turn something from years into months, or we may have to turn, years into days, depending upon what values that we're given. Okay? Or we might actually have to change our percentages around too. By the way, this 3/4%, right, that's 0.75, and that's how I ended up getting the 0.75%. Right? We want to make sure that we understand how to get those fractions. Okay? Then 3, I want to decide on an equation. I decide on an equation. In this case, it's my interest equation. Then 4, plug in my variables. And then 5, finally, right, do some algebra. So what we see here, this is basically the approach that we can take to these kind of problems. Now that I have an equation that I can use, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to then go search for some information that I'm going to be getting from a particular problem that I might be working on, or some work that I might be doing, say, at home or at work. Okay? I want to figure out what my rates are, what my time is, right? In this case, I need to figure out what I'm looking for. I'm looking for principal, and I'm given interest, so I need an equation that will relate interest and principal. What is that? That's this interest equation here, that simple interest equation. Once again, it's simple interest, okay? And then once I've done that, I plug it all into the equation, and I'm going to utilize a little bit of algebra in order to solve. So this actually completes our simple interest lecture. Some big things that are going to come up over and over again inside of our later lectures. 1, the idea of principal. You need to know what principal is. 2, you need to know what interest is. 3, we need to understand rates, and that rates are going to be written as decimals. And then 4, time. Time is generally going to be represented annually in terms of years, but we may have to do conversions. Conversions from years into months, or years into days, or days into years, or vice versa. Okay? And so we want to understand how it is that we go through to do those conversions as we're working more and more inside of finance. All right? This finishes the lecture.